In the peculiar world of Manyatta, where time seems to fold in on itself and reality bends at the whims of its residents, the saga continues with a spotlight on three unforgettable characters: Martha, the inadvertent menace of many Freeman, the tearful diva bound by her own emotions, and Ereng and Mareng, the hapless apprentices of a crooked master. Each one brings a unique flavor of chaos to this already surreal enclave, where normalcy is as elusive as a memory lost in the fog. As the curtains rise on part 2, prepare to be swept into a whirlwind of absurdity, as these three figures stumble through their days, creating mayhem in ways only Manyatta could inspire. Martha was the walking embodiment of a cosmic joke, one so rich in irony that even the stars might have chuckled. Her motor skills were, let's say, delightfully unpredictable, much like the weather in Manyatta, where logic and reason took frequent coffee breaks. Martha resided in house number 11, with a husband and son who were probably still wondering how they had signed up for this slapstick comedy of errors. Now, let's be clear, Martha was a nursery school teacher, which in any other world might mean she was a beacon of patience and poise, but in Manyatta, it meant she spent most of her days clinging to toddlers, half dragging them along like oversized dolls, and attempting to shake their tiny hands as if sealing a business deal with a corporate tycoon. The kids, God bless them, had no idea what kind of handshake roulette they were in for, each time wondering if they'd get a gentle squeeze or be swung around like a lasso. Martha had been born in Manyatta, and surprise had lived there her entire life. It's almost as if the universe had issued a no-returns policy on her. Her early morning errands were the stuff of legend, a disaster waiting to happen wherever her unpredictable feet wandered. Imagine this: you're minding your own business when Martha, in her infinite lack of spatial awareness, offers you a traditional Manyatta greeting, a handshake. Simple, right? Wrong. This was the kind of handshake that came with more strings attached than a puppet show. You see, Martha had this endearing little quirk where she'd shake your hand, maybe toss out a word or two, and then promptly forget you existed. She'd continue on her merry way, completely oblivious to the fact that she was still holding your hand. You'd be left there, trailing behind like an afterthought, hoping she'd remember to let go before you ended up face first in a wall, or with a shoulder dislocated by her sudden, inexplicable change in direction. It didn't stop at handshakes, oh no. Martha's forgetfulness extended to objects too. She'd wander around, half dragging anything unfortunate enough to get caught in her dress. The staff at Manyatta were well acquainted with the aftermath of Martha's morning strolls, often responding to chaotic incidents involving Martha, a rogue piece of furniture, or an innocent bystander who just wanted to say good morning without getting yanked into a living room rearrangement. On more than one occasion, they'd find her absent-mindedly dragging a chair, a table, or someone's laundry across the compound, completely unaware that she was moments away from turning Manyatta into her personal demolition derby. Among the many bewildered newcomers of Manyatta was Freeman, a woman who, after 45 years of what some might call wedded bliss, or wedded endurance depending on who you ask, decided she'd had enough of the grind. Who could blame her? With the constant allure of Manyatta, an infamous place where every day was a perpetual Sunday, and Monday mornings were nothing more than a distant, terrible memory she just couldn't resist, Freeman had been stewing in her restlessness for years, dreaming of a life where the calendar was permanently stuck on Friday nights. Forget Mondays, those horrors didn't even exist in Manyatta. It was always happy hour, the clock perpetually stuck at 6 p.m., where nightouts didn't require the tediousness of daybreaks. The very idea of it left her so intoxicated with desire that she did the unthinkable. She cleaned out the family savings, drained the bank account to the last penny, and bought herself a one-way ticket to this land of eternal weekends. Without a word to her husband, she packed her bags, probably more socks than she'd ever need. But hey, who was there to stop her and skip town like a woman possessed by the spirit of 1,000 unfulfilled Fridays? No goodbyes, no explanations, just the sweet, silent thrill of knowing she was heading to a place where the weekend never ended and the concept of Monday was about as real as unicorns. Her husband was probably still scratching his head, wondering where she had gone, as Freeman boarded that train to Manyatta, ready to lose herself in the endless loop of Friday nights, happy days, and a life free from the tyranny of alarm clocks and work schedules. The ultimate escape plan, executed to perfection, with no regrets and certainly no plans of ever turning back. As the sun blazed high in the sky and this Freeman's fragmented memory pieced itself back together, she would latch onto her phone like it was the last lifeboat on a sinking ship. With a list of every poor soul residing in Manyatta, she'd start dialing, working her way down the list with the ferocity of a telemarketer on commission. But don't be fooled, these weren't the polite, "How are you doing?" greetings of a civilized conversation. Oh no, Freeman had her own twisted version of phone etiquette, one that only Manyatta's twisted logic could justify. The moment anyone answered, she'd kick off with a facade of normalcy, something akin to, "Oh, hi. How's your day?" But before the poor resident could even muster a reply, Freeman would plunge headfirst into her own melodramatic abyss. It was like flipping a switch. 1 second she was all pleasantries, and the next, she'd be crying like a banshee at a funeral. And not just any funeral, her very own funeral, with herself as the chief mourner and eulogist. Turns out, Freeman wasn't just your average run-of-the-mill chatterbox. She was Manyatta's very own weeping owl, destined by the magnetic garments that half erased her memory to wail and lament at the drop of a hat. It was her addiction, her tragic calling, and her afternoon ritual rolled into one. The calls would go something like this. She'd begin with a calm, "I just wanted to say hello," only to quickly devolve into a sobbing mess. Tears would stream down her face, soaking her dress as she rambled on about who knows what, her lost youth, the injustice of gravity, the misplaced color of her neighbor's front door, until the entire conversation was nothing but a symphony of sorrow, crooning, weeping, mourning. She'd drench the airwaves with her tearful aria, leaving the listener on the other end utterly bewildered, if not mildly terrified. Freeman's daily performance, better known as her Symphony of the Weeping Owl, was nothing short of contagious, more infectious than the common cold at a daycare center. The poor neighbor, of course, would be the first to succumb, instantly catching her mournful melody as if it were some kind of vocal virus. Before you knew it, the neighbor was belting out their own tragic tune, transmitting the chorus to the next household like an emotional chain letter you couldn't escape. Often clueless about the cause of the ruckus, eagerly join in the impromptu chorus. But Freeman didn't stop until she had drained herself dry of every last tear. She'd sob and wail, pouring her heart out to whoever had the misfortune of picking up the phone, until exhaustion finally claimed her. Eventually, silence would reign as she collapsed into slumber, her phone still clutched in her hand, a modern-day tragic heroine undone by her own emotional theatrics. Ereng and Mareng, the middle-aged wonders of Manyatta, were about as native to that place as a penguin to the Sahara. Born under no particular star and blessed with no formal careers, they were the proud pupils of the most seasoned jailbird known to man. But, oh, how they failed. Failed so spectacularly that their only diploma was a one-way ticket to this exile paradise called Manyatta. You see, their escape to this realm wasn't by accident, but a desperate retreat from their master thief and conman extraordinaire. Yes, you heard me, these two knuckleheads were being trained in the fine art of thievery, specifically tailored for robbing unsuspecting travelers on the New York to Boston Greyhound route. Their nightly lessons? A crash course in how to rob the tired and unassuming, with a side of how not to get caught by the driver who thinks you actually know what you're doing. The mission was as simple as stealing candy from a baby, if the baby were a 250-pound, sleep-deprived commuter. Ereng and Mareng's task was to eavesdrop on their fellow passengers, figure out who had what luggage, and most importantly, where they were getting off. Then, with the precision of brain surgeons with tremors, they were supposed to alight 1 or 2 stops before the victims, convince the driver to unload the baggage, and make off with someone else's possessions. But here's where the comedy begins. Despite all their rigorous training, our dynamic duo couldn't even point out the right suitcase, let alone nab it. Each time the bus would stop, and their turn came to pull off the heist, they'd shuffle off the bus, fear gripping them tighter than their old man's necktie. When faced with the intimidating task of selecting the loot, they'd freeze, sweating bullets, and in a moment of sheer panic, they'd point at absolutely nothing, leaving the driver more confused than a goat on AstroTurf. Mareng was supposed to lead the grand exit like a lion leading its pride after their master gave the all-too-familiar signal. The signal which meant, "Hey Junior, wake up to work," a gesture they had rehearsed more times than a Broadway understudy. But instead, Mareng decided to play dumb. Maybe he was struck by a sudden bout of amnesia, or maybe he was just contemplating his life choices. But either way, he acted as though he had never seen that signal before in his life. An hour later, the bus reached Ereng's designated stop, and it was his moment to shine, or rather, to make off with someone else's belongings. But for reasons known only to the gods of buffoonery, both Mareng and Ereng decided to get off the bus together. Yes, you read that right, they both bailed out at the same stop, abandoning any pretense of sticking to the plan. As the master watched in disbelief, the duo shuffled off with the other passengers, pretending like they had business being there. They stood there, looking as inconspicuous as 2 mimes in a library, waiting for the driver to unload the luggage. But in a flash, before they could even make a move, the driver was back behind the wheel, and the bus roared off into the distance, leaving our 2 hapless heroes standing empty-handed. No loot, no glory, and absolutely no idea what to do next. The master, watching this disaster unfold, couldn't believe his eyes. Not only had his brilliant plan crumbled, but his prized pupils were now just a pair of clueless chumps with nothing to show for their night of criminal training. Realizing they had completely botched the job, Ereng and Mareng suddenly became aware of one very important thing: the wrath of their master was now hotter than a July heatwave. and it was heading straight for them. Desperate to salvage what was left of his shattered dignity, the master barked at the driver to slam on the brakes, claiming that his 2 forgetful students had left with an important document. The driver, either too tired to care or too polite to question, halted the bus. The master then sprang into action, racing off in hot pursuit of Ereng and Mareng, who were already halfway down the road, their failed heist turning into an endless game of cat and mouse. And so the chase began, an absurd, farcical dash across town, with the master desperately trying to catch up to his wayward disciples, all while the bus passengers wondered what on earth they had just witnessed. To escape the inevitable wrath of their master, whose fury could probably melt steel, our 2 illustrious failures, Ereng and Mareng, made a hasty decision to board a train bound for Manyatta, the last refuge for the world's most hopeless cases. Now mind you, these 2 masterminds of disaster didn't have a dime to their name, let alone enough cash to pay for the train ride. But in their infinite wisdom they figured, why not? What could possibly go wrong? Ereng and Mareng's master, always the cunning fox, spotted the train his bumbling apprentices had boarded and wasted no time slinking onto it himself. Of course, he wasn't about to take the same cabin as them. Oh no, he had to maintain his air of mystery after all. But when the conductor came around looking for tickets, the master decided to spin a tale so convoluted that even the conductor had to pause to scratch his head. He claimed, with the gravitas of a seasoned thespian, that those 2 young dudes up ahead were his protégés, his little lambs, his wayward pupils who somehow always managed to lose their way, wherever they're headed. He said, putting on his most sincere face, "Is where I need to go too. But here's the thing, I'm utterly clueless about the direction myself. Wouldn't you be so kind as to seat me near them? I wouldn't want to get lost, you see." As it turns out, everything. The train marshal, either moved by the master's apparent vulnerability or just eager to get on with his day, decided to grant the old man's wish. He shepherded him over to the cabin where his juniors were likely discussing their next brilliant mishap. And thus, the master was reunited with his students, not as the all-knowing mentor, but as the bewildered traveler, equally lost in the chaos that was surely to come. As it turns out, everything. The conductor, a man who had seen it all but was still baffled by the sheer audacity of these 2 freeloaders, asked for their tickets. With the grace of 2 squirrels and their master trying to play chess, Ereng and Mareng fumbled for an excuse, all while inching toward the nearest exit. But the conductor wasn't buying it. No ticket? No problem. All they had to do was sit back, relax, and enjoy the complimentary service, a swift introduction to the sleep influencer, otherwise known as a strong right hook. So there they were, 3 walking calamities crossing the threshold into Manyatta, where failure is not just expected, it's practically celebrated. Whatever nonsense Ereng and Mareng were about to stumble into, their master would be right there beside them, sharing in the impending debacle, and probably muttering under his breath about the good old days when train rides didn't involve babysitting these hapless thieves. Knocked into next week, and waking up with more than just a bruised ego, the trio found themselves tossed unceremoniously at the border of Manyatta, where the universe had seemingly given up on them. Of course, in Manyatta, even the most hopeless souls are welcomed with open arms, or at least with arms that haven't gotten around to slamming the door shut yet. Their grand arrival, more of a crash landing, really was met with the kind of indifference only a place like Manyatta could muster. After all, when you've seen one train hopping broke as a joke escapee, you've seen them all. When the train finally screeched to a halt at Manyatta, Ereng, Mareng, and their ever-watchful master stumbled out onto the platform. By some bizarre twist of fate, or maybe it was just the general wackiness that seemed to cling to them like glue, all 3 of their memories aligned for the first time in what must have been forever. They stood there, blinking in unison, like a trio of synchronized goldfish. The guards, who had seen just about everything under the sun in Manyatta, took one look at this odd little family and shrugged. Ah, they thought, must be a father and his 2 sons, finally throwing in the towel on the outside world and deciding to join the circus that is Manyatta. Of course, the guards couldn't have been more wrong, but how were they supposed to know? The trio looked convincingly related, same confused expressions, same slightly disheveled appearance, and all 3 were wearing that telltale "what on earth just happened" look. So without a second thought, the guards welcomed them in, probably assuming they were just another bunch of worn-out souls seeking refuge from the insanity of the outside world. Little did they know that the real insanity had just arrived on their doorstep, and it came in the form of a master thief and his 2, not-so-bright apprentices, now stuck in a place where the only thing they'd be stealing was each other's dwindling sanity. As Ereng, Mareng, and their master shuffled off the train, the guards at the Manyatta station did what they always do with new arrivals. They handed each of them a magnetic garment. The guards, with their highly sophisticated, or so they believed, new metallic garments fresh from the top-secret Manyatta authorities' lab, were itching to try them out. Enter Mareng, Ereng, and their ever-scheming master, three unwitting arrivals, perfect candidates for a spontaneous science experiment. These three stumbled into Manyatta at the exact moment the guards received their shiny new gear. Timing couldn't have been better for the overzealous security team. Like clockwork, and with an impressive display of automated efficiency, the guards slapped the experimental garments onto these poor souls without so much as a welcome to Manyatta. Naturally, Mareng, Ereng, and their master had no idea that their introduction to this supposed paradise came with a complimentary role as guinea pigs for Manyatta's latest fashion in forced restraint. These strange, heavy, ridiculously clingy outfits were standard issue at the Manyatta gates. Part security measure, part medieval torture device, the garments had a way of sticking to every metal surface in sight, ensuring that no one wandered too far too fast. If you tried to make a break for it, the nearest lamppost would stop you dead in your tracks. With their new uniforms on, the trio clanked and clattered their way through the gates like a mismatched set of living magnets. The guards, now fully convinced that they were dealing with a perfectly normal albeit a little odd family, ushered them along to their designated mezzanine apartment, at the far end of Court 5. Of course, mezzanine apartment was just a fancy term for the slightly elevated, perpetually creaky, and awkwardly sloped rooms that no one else wanted. As they walked, the magnetic garments did their job, pulling Ereng into a mailbox, Mareng against a street sign, and their master into a ferocious battle with a rusty old gate. By the time they reached their new home, they were practically a tangled mess of fabric, frustration, and sheer confusion. But to the guards, this was just another day in Manyatta where even the most chaotic arrivals blended seamlessly into the general bedlam. And so, with a final clang as they disconnected from the last metal obstacle in their path, Ereng, Mareng, and their master entered their new mezzanine apartment, ready to take on the next chapter of their increasingly surreal lives. Little did they know, they just signed up for a one-way trip to the heart of Manyatta's madness. Who's this guy that looks like my dad? Is this a prank? Did someone switch him out while I was lost in the fog? That was Mareng, standing there like a deer in headlights, eyes wide open and absolutely flabbergasted by the sight of a man who, by all appearances, was his father. The late afternoon light had just started slicing through the thick fog of memory that had kept him in a blissful state of ignorance all day. But as clarity settled in, Mareng found himself staring at this dude, same face, same eyes, same awkwardly charming teeth that could never quite handle a smile, same perceived dad walk that seemed to scream I've seen some things with every step. There was even that uncomfortably warm emotional connection, like a cozy sweater you didn't want to admit you loved. Mareng's memory was a tangled mess, like someone had thrown all his thoughts into a blender and hit puree before he signed up for that disastrous training with the world's most peculiar master. His mind would drift back to his dad, his image, his words, his everything. Now as dad he would mutter, as if that simple phrase was a lifeline to sanity, a mantra to hold onto before the inevitable memory erasure took its toll. But once the magnetic garment worked its peculiar magic, all that was left was a fuzzy reflection of what used to be. Any coherent memory of the Greyhound bus ride to Boston was gone, along with the frantic chase through the streets of Albany, New York, where his heart had pounded with the fear of a man hunted. Even the chaotic train trip to Manyatta, where everything was both familiar and foreign, was now nothing more than a blur of motion and confusion. Mareng couldn't quite fathom any of it. The entire sequence of events might as well have been a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The magnetic garment had done its job to perfection, scrambling his thoughts, erasing the memories that mattered, and leaving him in a state of bewilderment that was both frustrating and oddly comforting. The face of his father, once a clear and solid presence, was now just a ghostly image, a shadow of what it used to be. He could feel the remnants of those memories slipping through his fingers, as if trying to catch smoke. But hold up, was this his perceived dad? Really? Like really? Meanwhile, Mareng's perceived dad, who had been dealing with his own foggy mental state, looked at his son with the same level of confusion. Really, Mareng, he muttered, probably questioning every life choice that had led to this moment. See, perceived dad had been lucky or unlucky, depending on how you looked at it, because while Mareng could only manage to claw back 75% of his memory by bedtime, perceived dad usually got back half of his marbles by mid-afternoon, just in time for an existential crisis. The whole scene was like watching a bad soap opera where the characters couldn't remember their own lines, let alone who they were supposed to be. Mareng, bless his disoriented little heart, started calling out names like he was hosting some kind of bizarre, impromptu roll call, expecting his perceived dad to respond with a witty comeback, or at least a sarcastic remark. But his poor father just stood there, utterly unable to fathom the labyrinthine mess his son was wading through. 3 weeks into Chech's grand and gloriously confusing arrival in Manyatta, The much-anticipated and much-dreaded monthly meeting loomed on the horizon. As per tradition, the infamous concocted soup was once again dished out like it was the holy grail of bureaucratic memos. But of course it wasn't just any soup, it was a steaming broth of ingestible instructions, orders, and the ever-elusive password to unlock the month's internal memo. For most residents, this bizarre culinary ritual was just another day in their half-erased memory lives. But, for Chech, oh, it was a full-blown neurological roller coaster. Chechi, bless his soup-addled mind, embarks on a quest for the farthest, greenest patch of shrubbery he can find, convinced that the short trees waving in the breeze are really gangs of vengeful vehicle dealers lying in wait to ambush him. The wind becomes his enemy, every rustle a whispered threat, and Chech morphs into a master of stealth, lying flat on the ground like a secret agent in a bad spy movie, hoping the imaginary goons won't notice him. And so the entire night is spent in this ridiculous game of cat and mouse, with Chechi darting from one hiding spot to another, ever so careful to dodge the gaze of his non-existent pursuers. You see, Chechi's brain had its own, shall we say, unique way of processing these soupy commands. As the memory fog slowly lifted or perhaps thickened, who's to say, his first instinct was to go and hide. But not just anywhere, no, Chechi's erratic paranoia led him straight to the most inconspicuous place he could think of, the arboretum, where the grass and shrubs barely grew taller than 2 feet. In his mind, this was prime hiding territory, as if he were a jungle warrior on some covert mission. To everyone else, it was just Chech flat on his stomach, wriggling around like an awkward envelope tossed in the wind. But to him, he was expertly camouflaging, evading his imaginary car dealers, and dodging the wrath of his wife like an action star in a poorly budgeted thriller. The grass might as well have been his fortress, and the shrubs his elite cover. The wind becomes his enemy. Every tree branch swung by the and changing its appearance mean a new soul hunting him and forcing him to hop or deflate himself more inches to the ground, every rustle a whispered threat, and Chech morphs into a master of stealth, lying flat on the ground like a secret agent in a bad spy movie, hoping the imaginary goons won't notice him. End of part 2. The story is written by Nelson Deriva.